Hey guys, today in this video we're going to take a look at torso counter rotation during the linear drive phase, and we're going to touch on how if you can implement this correctly into your pitching mechanics, it's going to help you with disassociation later on in your delivery. So here I have Marcus Stroman. This is going to be the pro example we're looking at today, and what I want to kind of touch on is today we're going to be comparing the angle in which the lower half or the pelvis is pointed, so the directional angle there, versus the upper half and the upper half's directional angle. So we're going to be looking at the shoulders and kind of how, pretty early on in the delivery in the drive phase, players are already starting to implement disassociation so that as rotation starts to be implemented into the delivery, when we start to get into our lower half rotational move, we're going to see that that disassociation is going to work out perfectly from a timing perspective. So meaning that if we set up things correctly during the linear drive phase, as we begin to open up the pelvis and kind of initiate that whole rotational spiral of energy up the kinetic chain, things will be sequenced if we set ourselves up correctly before we get to that point. So here I have Marcus. This is kind of the bottom of leg decline, and we're going to take a look here. So where is his pelvis? When I talk about pelvis, we're going to talk about the front portion of his pelvis. So think about where your belt loop is and kind of that whole area of your waist. Where is it pointed here? It's probably pointed somewhere in about that direction would be my guess. So pointed somewhere off in there. We can already see here that Marcus obviously has more torso counter rotation with his upper half than what he has with pelvic coil or pelvic counter rotation with his pelvis. So we can clearly see that by looking at, what do we see here? Shoulders pointed off here. Pelvis is pointed off in that direction. So we can already see a disassociation of the two halves there, right? Upper half is more closed, meaning that we're counter-rotated. He's counter-rotated, closed off with his upper half, meaning the hitter could see his number on the back of his jersey, rotated this way. He's more counter-rotated with his upper half than he is with his lower half. What this is gonna allow him to do as we progress is you're gonna see that he's gonna continue to hold that torso counter rotation. The lower half is gonna begin to open up and rotate into front foot strike. And as a result of that lower half going, it's going to begin to pull the upper half. But as the upper half is being pulled by the lower half, the upper half is going to end up right in the perfect sequencing into front foot strike to where the timing is perfect and the shoulders are going to be right where we want them to be. So we'll talk a little more about that, but let's go ahead and get into it. So we can clearly see there's more disassociation there. Shoulders are more closed off directionally than the torso. than the pelvis. So let's go ahead and move on here. We're going to get him a little bit further down. So what do we see here? Now we're becoming more and more dissociated. Pelvis is pointed in that direction there, probably somewhere in there, maybe a little bit more, maybe somewhere in there. And now we can clearly see Marcus's upper half is pointed off in that direction, meaning that he has torso counter rotation. Torso counter rotation, if we think about rotation to throw the baseball is just normal rotation. So this way, torso counter rotation is the opposite direction of rotation. So meaning we're closing up. We can clearly see that Marcus is closed up here. His number is showing to the hitter. The hitter can see the number on the back of his jersey and his last name. And we can see the shoulders are clearly closed off, pointed way off towards the third base dugout. While the pelvis is already kind of not open, but it's kind of in a linear, it's lined up linearly with the intended throwing target. So we can clearly see very obvious torso counter rotation there. And now why is this important? So as we begin to see Marcus pull this front foot to initiate pelvic rotation, we're gonna start to see the pelvis open. The upper half, the lower half is going to pull the upper half rotationally, meaning the lower half's gonna go and the upper half is gonna start to follow. If we didn't have any of this disassociation that we see here, and Marcus's shoulders are pointed off in this direction, aligned with the pelvis, what we would actually see is that there wouldn't be any disassociation. Remember, we want the pelvis to go and the shoulders and the torso to kind of stay back. And it's not really so much a staying back, it's just a sequencing deal where it seems like we're staying back because of the disassociation that we've already implemented through counter rotation. But what would happen is as Marcus began to pull open, the shoulders would just go with the lower half if we weren't to implement any counter rotation. So we can see here, very obvious counter rotation. And now, so let's go ahead and watch. As Marcus goes into where he starts to pull that front foot back, very obvious, pelvis is here, pointed there. upper half very closed off. Again, torso counter rotation. And now let's go ahead and see what happens. So we're gonna start to see this upper half start to pull this way, okay? Along with the foot. But notice what's gonna happen. So the foot pulling, upper half starting to pull. We could see from there to there, that elbow is pulling back, right? But watch what happens in the front foot strike. Because his torso is more closed off than his lower half, he's gonna end up in a perfect sequence place right at front foot strike with the pelvis wide open, facing the target, and the shoulders still in alignment with the target, which is ultimately the exact place we want to be. So let's go ahead and watch. So what do we see right there into front foot strike, okay? So we saw the pelvis open, so the pelvis is pointed off in that direction now, right? And now we see that the shoulders are in that direction. So what do we see there? There's an obvious intersecting of the lines. We have disassociation, but what actually occurred was a lot of people think that disassociation is just a result of the pelvis opening and the upper half staying back and all that. No, really what it is it's just simply rotation occurring. But when we get to a point to where we have torso counter rotation and the pelvis initiates first and begins to pull through that torso, we want to be coming from a further place rotationally with the upper half so that as it begins to pull through, we can see that the hips are leading the torso and the upper extremity rotationally. And that's where we get that whole spiral or that tornado of energy going up the kinetic chain. So now we can clearly see pelvis is open, perfect there, shoulders in a perfect place. And that's ultimately all because of torso counter rotation. If we didn't have torso counter rotation, as the pelvis began to open, everything would just rotate in unison and we wouldn't have this disassociation. So let's go back one more time. What do we see? We see a large degree of torso counter rotation here. Perfect. Pelvis pointing there. As he begins to rotate, what are we're gonna see an obvious pulling of both extremities, lower and upper. And due to that counter rotation, we end up in this perfect position, exactly where we want to be, and just ultimately a great place to be. So torso counter rotation, to recap, is ultimately where our torso is, how it's rotated away from our intended release point. So we're rotating the torso away. How that ultimately is going to lead us to be better sequenced into front foot strike, where we allow the lower half to go and pull the upper half through by adding more rotational range through counter rotation with our upper half. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is something that may be kind of something new to you. If you have any questions, feel free to leave any comments below. And again, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.